many others to start exporting directly or to improve their exporting services. And then in some cases, admittedly relatively few, fair trade has facilitated producers to get involved in actually marketing their products. So, for example, there are a number of companies such as Agrifair in the EU, in the Netherlands, but it's got various other bases in different countries, and Day Chocolate Company in the UK, which are marketing companies. And each of these steps further along the value chain means that they have the opportunity to access the value that's created in the chain. And in a very few cases, they've actually got a share, producers have got a share in retail outlets. In recent years, there's been a real drive, and actually the kind of origins of fair trade labelling relate to this drive to mainstream fair trade, so get fair trade products into mainstream retail outlets. And clearly this has had an enormous impact in terms of growth. There's no kind of clear figures, but I've estimated that in the UK around 90% of fair trade products are now bought in mainstream retail outlets, particularly supermarkets. And this has obviously created a huge opportunity for spreading the gains of fair trade across a much larger number of producers and workers. But it also creates a number of challenges because mainstream commercial operators have their own way of working and their own commercial imperatives that sometimes have a tension or stand in tension with the social objectives of fair trade. And three kind of particular areas which have been identified through research that we've done at IDS are the kind of quality demands that are made by mainstream retailers. And by quality, it's not necessarily the kind of taste of a product. It's actually the appearance of a product. So, for example, in the banana sector, there's a real push from the retailers to produce bananas that are absolutely blemish-free, perfect fruit of a certain size. And this can make it quite difficult for fair trade, the more marginalised fair trade producers to participate. There's certainly evidence that the supermarkets in the UK have a preference for bananas coming from plantations over bananas coming from small producers, for example, and that's related to this ability of plantations to produce homogeneous, cosmetically perfect fruit. There are also cost pressures that arise, even though there's a fair trade minimum price. The retailers, certainly in the UK, and I think it's true in many countries, are operating in a very competitive commercial environment and do everything possible to reduce costs in their supply chains. And this again creates a kind of dynamic whereby there's pressure on buyers to source from the lower cost origins. And so in certain products there are different fair trade prices depending on the country of origin, which reflect different costs of production, but they also then allow for buyers to show a preference for the lower cost countries. And finally, there can be insecurity in the value chains that are linked to mainstream markets. In the UK, the retailers, even if they're selling own brand fair trade or private label fair trade products, they're not actually required to be licensees, and therefore they're not actually held to the flow standards in any respect. And this means that they don't actually have any kind of obligation for a long-term trading relationship with fair trade producers. So it can actually create quite a lot of insecurity in the value chain. And finally, in terms of economic impact, there is, as I said, there are actually relatively few studies on the impact of fair trade on plantations, but the evidence that there is suggests that there's less proof of a direct impact on wages. There are indirect impacts through the formalisation of employment and through the payment of legislated benefits that are associated with formalised employment, but there doesn't seem to be much direct impact on basic wage levels. The next area of impact I'm going to talk about is the social impacts of fair trade, and I've divided this into two categories of quality of life and empowerment. In terms of quality of life, again, the majority of studies find that there are positive effects from fair trade on the quality of life of both small producers and workers. And these include a range of different impacts, but higher standard of living, so better housing, greater investment in education, which is obviously very important in terms of sustainable development, better food, also community infrastructure and services as a result of investments from the fair trade premium. Also, households are less vulnerable to shocks or to falling into extreme poverty as a result of climatic disasters or price crashes. Again, the fair trade minimum price provides this kind of buffer effect. Fair trade can help enhance household and community cohesion. This is kind of largely related to the kind of collective organisation of things like spending of fair trade premiums. It gives communities a reason to get together and to work together, and that can have all sorts of multiplier effects. And it can reduce pressures for migration, so forced migration. I mean, in many countries, it's actually the kind of wealthier individuals that are migrating for positive reasons. But where producers are being forced to migrate because they literally can't make a living, fair trade has been shown to actually reduce those kinds of pressures. I think it's particularly true in coffee, and again, some of the findings that I'm referring to are probably dominated by what's happened in the coffee sector as a result of the price crisis. So there's a number of different positive effects on quality of life, but also the majority of studies find that many producers and workers are still poor. So fair trade's having a kind of poverty reduction effect, but it's not necessarily having a sustainable development effect. I mean, this actually, if you look at any particular case, it can vary between producers in one particular organisation. Some producers may be selling only very small volumes, and in that case, fair trade is really just allowing them to cover very basic needs. Other producers may be selling quite significant volumes and are entering into that kind of progression out of poverty into a sustainable development path, whereby they're reinvesting in their livelihoods, they're diversifying their income sources, they're investing in education and so forth. But overall, I think we can conclude that fair trade needs to look at how to strengthen its impact in terms of sustainable development. The other area of social impact of fair trade is empowerment. Empowerment generally I kind of think of, I mean there's lots of different definitions of it, but it's about having choices and control over one's own life. And being able to influence the decisions that are made that are going to affect your life. And the majority of studies on small producers find that there's a range of potential empowerment effects. Two kind of the strongest areas of empowerment are in terms of producer self-confidence, self-esteem, cultural identity. Fair trade has been shown to kind of strengthen their sense of worth. It is also very much, I think this is probably the strongest area of impact with small producers, is that it strengthens small producer organisation. It strengthens the democratic functioning procedures in organisations, the services that are offered to producers, strengthen their powers of negotiation with buyers and other institutional actors. And it's also allowed some small producer organisations to have a political influence over national policy, national agricultural policy, for example. So overall, quite strong evidence of impact on small producers, but for workers, although there can be some empowerment effects through particularly through the organisations that formed to allocate the fair trade premium, i.e. the joint body, it's usually called. In general, the empowerment of workers is quite limited, and that is related to the fact that workers are not organising through trade unions generally. Fair trade stipulates that there should be some form of worker organisation, and in most cases it's actually created workers' committees as opposed to affiliation with local trade unions, and there are a number of reasons for that which I don't have time to go into. But without that kind of independent organisation which has a much broader support base outside of the particular plantation, worker organisation can be quite limited, or the empowerment effects of worker organisation can be quite limited because of the employer-employee relationship, which is a relationship of power.